courtroom buzzed with quiet amusement as she stepped in. No briefcase, no assistant, no designer suit, just a plain black shalwar kameez, a notepad tucked under her arm, and eyes that carried calm instead of urgency. "She's lost," someone whispered from the back bench. "Probably here for someone else's case," chuckled a junior associate. One lawyer leaned over and smirked. "Maybe she thinks it's open mic night for first-year law students." She heard it all, but she didn't flinch. She walked to the front row, took a seat, and opened her notepad, unmoved by the sideways glances and patronizing smiles. No one knew her name. No one bothered to ask. Because in that courtroom, where suits signaled power and loud voices claimed authority, she didn't look like someone who mattered. What they didn't realize: the most powerful man in the judicial system, the one who had just stepped into his chambers upstairs, was not only the Chief Justice, he was her husband. And when he walked into that courtroom, he wouldn't need to raise his voice to silence an entire room. Because sometimes justice doesn't wear a robe. Sometimes she wears simplicity and carries a truth no one sees coming. Her name was Amina Rahman, soft-spoken, deliberate, and never one to perform for a room. She had a master's in constitutional law, years of research experience, and a deep respect for the justice system. But she had chosen to work behind the scenes, writing briefs, advising quietly, and building her legacy through action, not attention. She wasn't new to this courtroom. In fact, she had helped draft several of the arguments that had been quoted here over the years. But no one remembered that, because she had never taken credit, and because she never played the game the way others did. She wasn't interested in status lunches or backroom politics. She didn't chase senior partners or flash credentials to earn respect. She believed the work should speak, and if it didn't, no speech could save it. Her husband, Chief Justice Hassan Rahman, understood this about her. He admired it. It was why he fell in love with her years ago, not at a gala, not through a headline, but during a quiet panel where she challenged an outdated law with nothing but data, clarity, and dignity. Together, they lived privately. No PR, no photos, no name-dropping, which is why no one in that courtroom had the faintest idea who she was. They saw a woman without polish, not realizing she had more power than any polished argument in the room. This particular day, Amina had come to observe a case regarding land rights, something she had worked on extensively, though quietly. She planned to take notes, nothing more. But the tone in the courtroom was smug. Whispers, snide comments, even a chuckle from a senior lawyer who mistook her for a clerk. They laughed at her silence. But silence is a choice. And when the Chief Justice walked in, it would become very clear who had just entered his courtroom and who had just stepped on their own dignity without knowing it. The case of Aziz versus Provincial Land Authority was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, and the courtroom was already buzzing with lawyers, interns, and observers, most of whom were more concerned with being seen than understanding the law. Amina sat in the second row, quietly flipping through her notes. She had spent months researching this case, not for applause, but because she believed in what was at stake: the right of rural families to retain ancestral land that was now being auctioned off under corporate pressure. But in that courtroom, her presence was treated like an anomaly. A young associate smirked at her notepad. Bringing handwritten notes. What is this, law school? His colleague leaned over, voice laced with sarcasm. She must be one of the villagers, maybe here to beg for her uncle's farm. Another whispered, no heels, no laptop, no ID badge, definitely not counsel. Even the opposing counsel, a slick-talking attorney with too much gel and too little humility, looked her up and down and scoffed, I think this seat is reserved for legal professionals. Amina didn't respond. She shifted over, allowing him to pass, then returned to her notes. But the whispers didn't stop, as she made a margin note beside a highlighted clause from the 1973 Land Reform Act. She felt eyes on her again, this time from a junior judge's assistant, who approached with visible irritation. Ma'am, unless you're a member of legal counsel or directly involved in this case, I'll have to ask you to move to the public gallery, he said. Before she could reply, A voice near the bench chimed in. "She's clearly lost. Let's not waste court time with charity seating." A few chuckles followed. Low, but sharp. Amina calmly stood, moved to the gallery, and sat in the last row. Still composed, still silent. She didn't need to defend her presence. She had already defended the case through research that now formed the backbone of the plaintiff's argument. And soon, the man she shared her home and heart with would walk into that room, wearing the robe and authority they all claimed to respect, and their smugness would start to unravel. Because Chief Justice Hassan Rahman didn't just know the law, he knew exactly how his wife had been treated. One of the court clerks had texted him before the hearing. "Your wife is here. They don't know. It's bad." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. But the moment his name was announced and he entered the room, everything shifted. Backs straightened. Papers rustled. Phones disappeared. The courtroom stood. And Amina? She remained seated. Not in disrespect, but because she had already risen above them. As Chief Justice Hassan Rahman entered the courtroom, a hush settled like dust in sunlight. Every lawyer in the room stood with stiff backs and nervous hands, the kind of collective posture that only came with fear disguised as respect. But one woman in the back row did not rise, not out of defiance, but because she didn't need to. His eyes swept over the room, calm, practiced, and unreadable. But when they reached the last row, they lingered for just a second. Enough to confirm what the clerk had messaged him. Enough to see that she was still calm, still dignified, still unbothered. He took his seat at the bench. "This court is now in session," the clerk announced. Opening arguments began. The opposing counsel, the same man who had dismissed Amina earlier, stood to speak. He gestured dramatically, flexed legal jargon like it was poetry, and cracked a smug smile at the gallery. Throughout, Amina sat silently, fingers resting lightly on her notes. She didn't flinch when he misquoted the Land Reform Act. She didn't react when he cited precedent that had already been overturned. She simply waited. Justice Rahman let him speak uninterrupted, but when it was over, he closed the file slowly and looked directly at him. "Counsel," he said, voice calm but edged in something sharper. "Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the woman seated at the rear of this courtroom." Several heads turned. "Her name," he continued, "is Amina Rahman." The attorney stiffened. A few associates glanced at one another, confused. She is not only a legal scholar with published work on land and constitutional law, but her research has been instrumental in framing the plaintiff's argument for today's hearing. Now the room shifted. "She also happens to be my wife," he added, not boastfully, but with a quiet finality. Murmurs rippled. The very people who had sneered at her now sat flushed and wide-eyed. "And while this court holds no room for personal bias," he said, eyes narrowing slightly, "it also holds no tolerance for arrogance." He paused. "Let it settle. When we begin to measure a person's legal worth by their shoes, their seating, or their silence, we forget what justice is meant to protect." The courtroom fell into full silence. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The opposing counsel cleared his throat. "Your Honor, there is no need to explain." Justice Rahman cut in gently. "You've already said enough." He nodded toward Amina. "To those who doubted her presence, let this moment remind you that not every voice speaks loudly, but some carry more weight than the ones that do." Amina gave the faintest smile, not of pride, of peace, because the truth had spoken, and the court had finally listened. The rest of the hearing proceeded, but it did so with a reverence that hadn't been there before. No one whispered. No one smirked. No one dared glance sideways at the woman they had spent the morning mocking. Instead, they listened, not just to the legal arguments, but to the reminder hanging in the air. Respect isn't earned through noise. It's revealed in stillness. The plaintiff's counsel leaned heavily on the framework Amina had built, her research, her clarity, her insight. And as the case unfolded, it became clear that her work had not just supported the case, it had strengthened it beyond challenge. At the conclusion, Justice Rahman offered his closing remarks with composure. "This courtroom," he said, "must never forget that law is not a performance. It is a principle, one upheld not by the loudest in the room, but often by the quietest minds behind the scenes." When the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Amina remained seated. She wasn't there to be applauded. She was there to protect something bigger than her pride. Several of the same people who had mocked her now lingered near the exits, unsure whether to apologize or disappear. One young law clerk, her face red with shame, finally approached. "I didn't know who you were," she said quietly, "but I should have respected you anyway." Amina looked up and replied gently, "That's the part that matters most, respecting people before you know who they are." And then she walked out, not beside her husband but ahead of him, because in that room, on that day, she had reminded everyone that true authority isn't announced, it's lived. Amina never asked for recognition. She didn't correct the whispers. She didn't flash credentials or call for attention, because she didn't need the room to know who she was. She just needed them to remember what respect should look like. And by the end of the hearing, she had taught that lesson without raising her voice once. Have you ever been judged for staying quiet, only to prove your strength without saying a word? Or maybe you've seen someone misjudged, only to witness them change the atmosphere through their grace. Tell us in the comments, because your story might be the quiet power someone else needs to hear today. If this story struck a chord, subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us. We tell stories for people who don't need to shout to be unforgettable. And remember, dignity doesn't demand attention, and real power never rushes to prove itself. Sometimes, the one they mocked at the start of the hearing is the reason justice shows up at all. Until the next story, stay steady, stay silent if you must, but never let anyone decide your worth based on how loudly you enter the room.